Hello interwebs, I hope you're all doing well, and oh boy, I have quite literally just gotten home, and when I say quite literally, I mean I literally just walked in the door, found this picture, and turned on my camera to talk to all of you. Gotten home from seeing The Batman, Matt Reeves' recently released Batman movie, except for he added a "the" at the front. Because it's different. That's what these DC movies are doing now. They're adding a "the" at the beginning. The Suicide Squad, The Batman. We'll get The Superman probably next at some point. But jokes aside, initially this video is just going to be my review of this movie, talking about like the technical aspects. How did our boy Cedric Diggory do in the role? How was the action sequences? All that sort of stuff. Sort of the typical review thing that you sort of put up to discuss about a film right after its release. But as I was sitting in the theater, I do what my, SJW brain does and started thinking about the ideology and politics of this movie, because I feel like the politics of this movie were deeply complicated in a way that I found vastly intriguing and wanted to just offer up as a discussion to begin talking with all of you about, because I feel like quite often when we talk about comic book movies, yes, we do talk about the politics of them, but usually that's a discussion that comes longer down the line, once we've had time to sit down, analyze, look over the film. But ultimately, I want to have this conversation right now because I think there's a kernel of some really interesting ideas that I think this movie is wrestling with, but ultimately fails to fully comprehend and articulate in a way that I find to be deeply fascinating about where this film is trying to place itself within the larger discussion that we're having today about politics, about systemic issues, about justice. And I think this movie, like many comic book movies really in general, is showcasing these ideas and where sort of mainstream sort of touchstones are on it in a very heightened, over-the-top, very comic booky way. Because when we look at comic book superheroes, they tend to be very flexible in where their ideologies range from. I mean, the Batman himself, many people just sort of chalk him up as like, hey, he's a rich guy who beats up poor people and doesn't do anything to help systemic issues or problems, and makes him a very like status quo, ultimately somewhat conservative type of hero. But I do feel like that ends up missing some of the ways Batman's been used throughout his history. I mean, we do have very right-wing usages of Batman. I mean, you could look at things like The Dark Knight Returns, which use Batman in a very right-wing and ultimately very, very authoritarian and even somewhat fascist ways if you really look at the ideology of some of that comic book. But then you also do have stories where Batman is being used in ideological ways that are completely different from that. I think one of the most obvious in direct comparison to The Dark Knight Returns would be the Red Sun version of Batman, who ultimately there is being used to represent more of a working class sort of background in opposition to Superman's more Stalinist and imperialist viewpoint in that comic book, as well as Lex Luthor's more capitalist representation in that comic as well. And ultimately, I feel like when we think about the pop culture perception of Batman, mainly garnered from a lot of his movie appearances, it's ultimately been very status quo affirming / can also lean into authoritarian. We have Zack Snyder's much more like violence, authoritarian sort of strongman idea that ultimately goes back to Zack Snyder's more complicated views on things like objectivism that we see throughout his works, but this idea of like the one big strong guy that can sort of beat up people and look how cool he is to, fight and destroy things and go and take on Superman, and this sort of like more nihilistic view of things. But then we also have things like Christopher Nolan's Batman movies, which ultimately kind of wrestled with themselves in a lot of different ways, because they were ultimately movies that felt very at tension with themselves. They would say things like, we're going to use the surveillance system and sort of use people's phones against their will in order to try to surveil people, but we're going to also say that it's bad within the course of the film, and that Morgan Freeman can like put in his name and turn it off, and it's all fine, we did the bad thing, but we recognize that it was okay. And then ultimately you have something like The Dark Knight Rises, which felt like it was trying to give voice to some of the anxieties coming out of the Occupy Wall Street movement, with the character of Bane sort of voicing those sort of same, and even Catwoman in that movie voicing the same sort of rhetoric of, the privilege, the 1%.
We take Gotham from the corrupt, the oppressors of generations who have kept you down with myths of opportunity.
But ultimately vilifying all of that in sort of in ways that many Hollywood movies often do, by sort of placing these more status quo challenging ideologies in the mouth of the villain. And also that movie doing a lot of heavy lifting to place the police force as like this symbol of strength and something to trust in that movie. Something that I spoke about, by the way, in this video if you want to check it out. And so Batman has been very much used in these sort of more status quo affirming right-wing and sometimes conservative and even right-wing usages in his pop culture appearances. But looking at the Batman, I feel like it does have some of the same exact problems of Christopher Nolan's movies, in that it ultimately is very conservative in terms of what it wishes to challenge in the status quo, and part of that's sort of baked into the whole idea of Batman, where he like works with cops and is friends with like Jim Gordon and things like that. But I also feel like this movie can't be chalked up as like, oh look, it's a right-wing Batman movie. I think it's ultimately a movie that is kind of at tension with what it wants to say and recognize, because I feel like the movie is trying to get at this idea of needing systemic change, of wanting to recognize that something needs to change here, but doesn't wish to go far enough to really question what that would actually mean and showcase how that actually would reveal itself in a world like Gotham that is so corrupt and so systemically unjust that it just ultimately, I think, fails at it, but I think in a way that is very fascinating, and I just want to talk about it. That being said, before I get into it, I am going to go into full spoilers about this movie because I cannot talk about these issues without revealing the entirety of the plot of the film. So if you have not watched the movie, this is your place to stop. But if you have seen the movie or don't care about, spoilers being revealed in the movie, I'm going to go full into it here. Okay, so now that we're past the spoiler warning, I think the best place to start here is with the character of the Riddler. Again, revealing full spoilers here, we ultimately come to learn that the Riddler was an orphan who was used as a political tool by Thomas Wayne, Bruce Wayne's father, who was running for mayor, who ultimately got forgotten when Thomas Wayne was killed that one night in the alley, and basically became forgotten by the system, while at the same time, big rich boy Bruce Wayne was being lionized to this poor orphan boy. And we ultimately get a speech from the Riddler at the end of the film where he basically states as such, like, I was actually suffering. I got forgotten by this system, and you, big rich boy, you did not actually have to deal with the actual problems that were caused by the fact that people just forgot about us. And so from there, he, when he gets older, starts to enact his, crime spree as the Riddler, where he starts going after many of these figures within the corrupt system of Gotham that sort of led to people like him being forgotten, and also unveiling a sort of story of injustice and corruption seated at the heart of Gotham that tangentially involved Bruce Wayne's father himself, Thomas Wayne. We have the DA, we have the mayor, we have crime boss Carmine Falcone, who, by the way, is played fantastically here. I absolutely love Carmine Falcone. But these figures, minus maybe Carmine Falcone, though even he himself is very ingrained in a lot of these systems within Gotham. And ultimately, we could sort of chalk the Riddler up to that same sort of idea that we saw with Bane over in The Dark Knight Rises, in that he is this sort of like vilification of calls for change of systemic systems. I mean, he wants to root out the corruption within Gotham and is ultimately doing it in a very violent way that is ultimately leading him to be seen as the villain of the movie. And on top of that, he very clearly throughout the film displays some signs of having some sort of mental health issues as well, which is also this whole thing of like villainizing mental health issues, when in reality, people with mental health issues often tend to be the victims of violence more often than the perpetrators of violence. But to be fair, I can't just place that on this movie. That sort of vilification of people suffering from mental health issues is a problem for the entirety of the Batman mythos. So that's just sort of like baked in to this whole idea. And also what becomes even more kind of frustrating is we ultimately learn at the end of the movie that the Riddler was radicalized online with a small insular group of people who became very like gun supporting and violent, and also had been forgotten by the system, who ultimately wished to enact violence upon people, namely in the climax of the film, the recently elected mayor. And we'll talk about her in just a minute. And so all of this kind of feels very misunderstanding how a lot of this sort of violence gets enacted and these sort of movements happen, because when we look at online radicalization groups like the one sort of depicted within the film that the Riddler fell into, they don't usually try to enact their violence upon systems of corruption like mob bosses or systemic injustice. Quite often these groups get radicalized into blaming minorities and minority figures, usually from more authoritarian leaders that they sort of get their rhetoric from, or from conspiracy theory sites that they were more primed to because they have been isolated, very radicalized online spaces. And so the film tries to like map that sort of anger and vitriol onto movements calling for status quo changes, when ultimately a lot of these people, while I think the kernel of where they're feeling anger and being forgotten by the system is very real and very true, the ultimate victims of their violence don't feel realistic to what we would actually see being enacted in real life. And ultimately, like I said, that could be chalked up to doing the same sort of thing that Bane was doing, vilifying sort of movements that are asking for more systemic change by just ultimately saying they're violent, they're just trying to kill people, they don't really have a belief in their underlying ideology. But unlike Bane, who ultimately gets revealed to just be using the rhetoric of populism in order to gain power, the Riddler ultimately very much believes this. He very much does believe this systemic issues, and one of the other things that I found to be particularly interesting about how this character was used was we ultimately see that these people online were radicalized by their belief in the Batman. Because throughout the movie, Batman is referred to as Vengeance. People call him Vengeance. Even he himself says, "I am Vengeance." And when at the end of the film, Batman stops these bad guys from killing the mayor of the town, they recite the same thing. They say, I am Vengeance. Clearly evoking that they were inspired by the same, by Batman's sort of willingness to enact violence and anger and beat up people in a way that Bruce Wayne starts to get challenged by throughout the film. There's ultimately one great moment with Paul Dano speaking to Batman who says, "I thought you were on my side. I thought you and I were doing this together." And Batman sort of has to confront at the end of the movie that he really kind of aided this guy's agenda. Even though that wasn't his intention, he kind of inspired them and ultimately kind of was feeling the same things that they were feeling, this sort of problems with the system. Many times he confronts the police commissioner, who is not Gordon in this movie, or other people working within Gotham, and starting to recognize that a lot of this is corruption rooted at the core of what this city is. And I like that at the end of the movie, Batman gets challenged in that way, and it doesn't completely get resolved. The movie kind of ends with him recognizing that there is much larger systems to be rooted out and dealt with within this world of Gotham. And quite literally, the city is flooded in a way that's reminiscent of the Nightfall storyline from the comics. And even Batman uses a thing like Venom at one point towards the end of the film, which also kind of evokes that storyline as well, like this sort of steroid stuff. And so there's this challenge from the movie to Batman that says, hey, you are feeling this same alienation from this system that we are, and you're also enacting it in violent ways. And how ultimately that sort of strongman violence that comes from this place of willing to isolate yourself and this need to enact anger and vitriol towards the system can ultimately inspire further people to enact violence, especially young men who are also isolated and forgotten by these systems and feel an alienation from these systems. And instead of inspiring them to wish to work to change the system in ways that are more healthy, instead they become insular, form insular communities that further radicalize themselves and then enact violence further upon the world. And so I think that element of the Riddler storyline was incredibly true, and I really liked that they showed that he was part of this very ultra-radicalized community that found community amongst itself and ultimately were inspired by Batman to enact violence because they were feeling disassociated and forgotten from the system, even though I do think that their ways that they enacted this violence against the system was not necessarily true to how groups like this would have been actually radicalized within real life. And also the movie, several times throughout the film, through the character of Alfred, also subtly starts to confront him and say, like, you can do more as Bruce Wayne. You can start to help these people by thinking about what the Wayne Corporation can do. And also there's the mayor of the town, who is sort of the running for mayor throughout the film and ultimately gets elected mayor, where she has one scene in the movie where she talks to Bruce Wayne and she tries to convince him, like, hey, you as Bruce Wayne, she doesn't know he's Batman, saying, like, you can do more. You've kind of just set out, but you're ultimately not doing anything to help the city. And that sort of is a background element to all of this, but it does sort of play a role ultimately in challenging Batman's sort of recognition that these systems inherent within Gotham are a problem. But that being said, I don't want to just also say, like, hey, this movie is actually doing something really deep, because like I said, it is also not recognizing that the victims of violence of this type of terrorism and this type of violent inactions and sort of radicalized groups that the Riddler represents ultimately would be more marginalized people. But the film is starting to push at this idea of systemic change. And we also see that within the character of Selina Kyle as well, where we also see this really interesting tension, because I do think there is a problem within the film of how the film frames Selina Kyle. There is this very male-gazy sort of look at her. I mean, there's quite literally a scene where we have to see her undress, like Batman's watching her from outside and creepily watching her undress. While I love the performance of Selina Kyle, there's ultimately this, like, sexual tension that's like she really wants to make out and be with Batman at certain points, especially earlier on. She wants to be protected by him. You know, she can handle herself, but she also likes to know that he's there to protect her. And we get sort of a hint of that where, like, he leans in and he's checking her out, like, these eyeglass things that has in her eyes. And she, like, kind of wants to maybe have a kiss. It's sort of insinuated, and no, it doesn't. And also, at the end of the film, she saves Batman to show that she's strong and can do it herself, but then also she starts to get strangled as well and gets saved by Batman twice in the movie. She gets saved from him being strangled. We can't just have her save Batman. He has to then save her to, like, reaffirm that he's the strong hero of the movie. So there is that sort of, like, interesting tension in wanting to show Selina Kyle as an agent of her own, but also still sort of placing Batman as the hero and having to have the agency, and also sort of her being this, like, romantic interest for him. But also the movie allows Batman throughout the film to see things from her point of view. Quite literally, there's points in the movie where she is going into Penguin's bar in the Iceberg Lounge and gets sort of seen by men, has to, like, look back at them for Batman to get scans of them, but she knows inherently that doing that will draw the attention of the man, and Batman sort of asking her to do things and ask questions for him without recognizing the danger that puts her in, and also not realizing that her goal isn't to take down the entire system, it's just to save her friend, who ultimately does get killed in the film because Batman wasn't even thinking about her, wasn't trying to really save her. Yes, she would have liked to, I'm sure, but he ultimately kind of loses her for the bigger picture that is going on. And while I dislike the woman being fridged and killed for Batman's story and just being like a sex worker who was ultimately murdered for the story, which is too often a trope in these types of stories, I do like that, there's a challenging of Batman to have to see things from another point of view in a way that I feel like The Dark Knight Rises tried to do with Catwoman in that movie, with her being like, oh, you Bruce Wayne, you stayed up here and leave nothing for the rest of us. Whereas this movie actually allows Batman to sort of get an idea of what it's like to be in this world and to understand the way a woman has to find herself in these sort of, these systems that she doesn't really have a choice in and how to handle dealing with them, and how she doesn't have Batman's agency. She doesn't have his money to be able to, enact the same sort of change that Batman is capable, but ultimately sometimes unwilling to recognize and to do. And I really, I love that tension. And those are just two examples of how this movie kind of has this interesting tension where it both recognizes that there's larger systems at play that Batman is ultimately ignorant of and not recognizing, but also not going super far enough into recognizing what that would actually mean on an actual demonstrable, like, changing the system level. What would it mean that if he recognizes that the system needs to change, how would that actually go about? And the movie sort of misses actually trying to address that in any way by individualizing a lot of the problems instead of really addressing the systemic issues throughout it. What do I mean by that? Well, at one point in the movie, we ultimately learn that Batman's father, Thomas Wayne, also was wrapped up in a lot of these, like, injustices throughout Gotham, and that he may have played a part in murdering a reporter in order to hide his past, again, showing corruption and the sins of the father. And this does force Batman to have to wrestle with his relationship to his father's legacy, to his legacy of power, to being in these systems within Gotham that he is a part of. And that feels very true, that a billionaire would have propped up these systems of injustices in order to further his own power, and not to actually help people, just using people like the orphans that we see him sort of using as political tools, but ultimately kind of gets forgotten after his death. And I would have loved that. That would have been very reminiscent of the Telltale Batman games. If anyone has played the Telltale Batman games, you should play them. Telltale aside is a complicated company before it was changed into whatever the new Telltale is going to be. The games themselves have a really great story where they do present Thomas Wayne as a kind of villainous figure, as a figure who was rooted in the systemic problems of Gotham that Batman then has to wrestle with. But ultimately in this movie, that doesn't actually happen. We ultimately learn that Batman's father was just a dude who made a mistake, that he went to Carmine Falcone because he was scared for Batman's mother. He had a personal reason, not a political power reason. He was scared of something about Bruce Wayne's mother's history coming out, which I don't think we ultimately even learn what that is. And that he made a mistake by going to Carmine Falcone, trying to protect his mother, and that it wasn't a systemic problem, and that he ultimately was still a good man. Yes, he got got punished for it. Yes, he got murdered for it, but he was still a good man at heart, and that Bruce Wayne doesn't really have to wrestle. He almost does, but he doesn't really have to do that soul searching that would require him to recognize the system that he's ultimately playing into as a billionaire in this world who is not helping change the system, just going out and punching, poor people. And I think it would have been a much stronger choice to not lose that ambiguity about Batman's father, that to let Bruce Wayne wrestle with that in perpetuity as opposed to alleviating him of that need to do that work. And I feel like that's a big miss by the film as well. And the other two things that I think this film struggles with constantly too is that Bruce Wayne throughout the film does challenge the police system. He calls out two commissioners throughout the film who basically were part of these big injustices. And we ultimately learned that a lot of the cops are also on the payroll of the big crime boss, Carmine Falcone. And that a lot of these cops are corrupt. And that is a brilliant thing to really look at how cops and the police force ultimately do prop up these corrupt systems. We've been talking about that in the systemic injustices the police enact and the violence that they enact on people trying to push back against the problems inherent in our system throughout the past year, going back to the protests that happened 2 summers ago. But again, this gets complicated too because we ultimately have Gordon, right? Who is the uncorruptible cop. There's even a point in the movie where Batman says, like, I know I can trust you because you're a good cop. You're uncorrupted. And we also get at the end of the film when they go to arrest Carmine Falcone, who says, like, I'm going to walk out of this. All the police force are on my side. I have them in my pocket. And we walk out and we see like this field of cops. And Gordon says, well, not all of us. And we get this idea is like, oh, there are good cops too. And so again, the film is saying like, we're not going to challenge the system. We're going to say there are individual corrupt cops, but there's still cops within this system who are good and they can still do good things without really complicating that relationship for anybody, not even Gordon, who is dealing with corrupt police force members throughout the film. He never ultimately has to wrestle with his place as a cop in that system. He can just be like, I'm one of the good ones and I can make this system work, even though I kind of have to surreptitiously go underground to work with Batman. Again, that's another thing too. We see police officers saying like, why are you working with Batman? You should stop doing that. And yet he's still allowed to keep working with Batman throughout the film, even if he, like, there's allusions to the fact that he's hiding it, that he's like doing it off the books after he gets confronted with it by the police commissioner in one scene. But then it really gets brought up too much and we don't really get to see Gordon wrestling with that in any real way. And I think ultimately one of the biggest versions of this that we see on a very political level is the mayor herself, because throughout the film, the mayor that we see sort of running for mayor here is kind of draped in the same rhetoric and trappings of Obama from years ago. Like, change is her big slogan, just one word. And she ultimately represents like, I want to, change our system, restore. And ultimately in the film, she has this big speech about we need to restore people's belief in our institutions. But we also have no idea what her beliefs are, what she wants to change about the system. She just sort of becomes symbolic of this desire for change in the city without really showcasing what it is. And also, she sort of, again, in the way that Obama kind of represented, and I think, by the way, FD Signifier has a wonderful video that he released just recently about the history and the complex history of Obama that showcases that he was a man that represented change to the system, but in a very superficial way that ultimately didn't challenge it. And we see it too with Biden. Biden was supposed to be like this return to normalcy when he was elected, but the normal that we were at was still perpetuating many systemic injustices that we see being perpetuated. We're still seeing issues of people being put into cages at the border or drone strikes being used and numerous things that are still a problem under Biden that are just considered as like return to normal. And ultimately, this mayor character represents that as well. She's supposed to be this nebulous version of change to the system, and that's draped in the rhetoric of change and like affronting the system. But ultimately, we don't have any demonstrable way to show that. And so that's where I kind of end with this film, in that I think it's really wrestling with itself in a way that I don't think The Dark Knight Rises ultimately did. The Dark Knight Rises tried to showcase these ideas, tried to give breath to them, but ultimately just sort of vilified them, said that the people who believed in them didn't really believe in them, they were just being used for power, and that they were using populist rhetoric for power and not really talking about what the actual systems at play that needed to change in Gotham were. But this movie is somewhat different, because I feel like it wants to directly confront Bruce Wayne and say, Bruce Wayne, as a rich man in this system who is going out and just beating up poor people, you are ultimately inspiring the same kind of violence that is encouraged in these sort of radicalized groups that you are somewhat representative of. But also, as a rich person, you have a legacy, at least in your family, and also just within the systems that you get your wealth from, of perpetuating the systems that ultimately benefit the powerful and hurt those lower on the rung, like Selena Kyle, who are sort of taken advantage of, especially as women, especially as women of color, and things like that. Not want to have him wrestle too much with it, nor is it willing to confront us with what it would actually mean to change those systems, what it would actually mean to say, yes, this is a systemic problem. What do we do about that? And ultimately individualizes it and says, we can fix it by maybe putting the right people in the right places, but not actually confronting those people either with what their ideology would mean, like Gordon or the mayor, or not actually showcasing them wrestling with the inherent corruption within these systems. And ultimately, too, just like how the film eschews talking about it when it comes to the Riddler, most of the film does avoid talking about issues of marginalization. How this film quite often just ignores how issues of race, gender, and general just people who are marginalized would also suffer under these systems. While we do see that Selena Kyle does not make a lot of money, we never really have to see or address what Selena Kyle would have to face being a black woman within the city of Gotham and the systemic injustices that she would probably see every single day, especially given that she works in a club like the Iceberg Lounge. Or Gordon being a black cop within the corrupt system of the Gotham PD, or even the mayor, who is a black woman who most definitely would have to address issues of race, being a black woman running for mayor in a city like this. And not actually addressing what it would mean to be a black person or a woman within these worlds, I think it's kind of a miss, especially when this film is directly trying to talk about systemic issues. I mean, again, as I mentioned, like, what would it mean for a black man to be a cop within this world? It ultimately feels very superficial in a way that I think this movie could have addressed in a really intriguing way, and is very germane to the themes of the movie, but is ultimately just a miss. Hey, Editing Jesse here, and yes, the creature that you currently see on your screen right now is me when I'm not all put together on camera for all of you. I'm a fucking mess in real life behind the camera. But regardless, I wanted to add this bit right here because I slept on this movie and it came to understand overnight what I was really feeling about it, in that this movie, The Batman, is attempting to be in the tradition of detective noir thriller films, and in those films, they are movies that are reveling in their ambiguity. I mean, look at some of the best noir movies like The Third Man or Chinatown, Roman Polanski being a horrible person aside. Those movies end with directly confronting the ambiguity within their worlds. Like, hey kid, it's just Chinatown is literally how Chinatown ends. And it's this very ambiguous statement that these systems, these corrupt systems, will be perpetuated. But because this is a Batman movie, because this is a superhero movie, where we typically want to see our good guy kind of win and defeat the bad guys at the end, there's this inherent tension in this movie attempting to try to be this detective noir thriller, trying to end with that ambiguity, which this movie does do. It does have that ambiguous ending with Gotham literally flooded and them literally state things are going to get worse before they get better, but ultimately also wanting to give Batman this sense of triumph. I mean, in the end of the movie, he realized that because he has inspired these violent figures, he needs to become something more than just fear, but become an inspiration. And so he saves the mayor and everyone in that final moment where he like cuts the electric wire and saves everybody. He becomes this inspiring figure, which I really, really loved. But because of that, the movie is at tension because it wants to have Batman be this affirming figure, be this hero who ultimately doesn't have to wrestle necessarily personally with the ambiguity. He does a little bit, but he doesn't have to sit with it as much as like other characters, like Jack Nicholson's character in Chinatown, have to sit with it because they were part of these systems that ultimately reaffirmed it. So I think that's the real tension here, that it's a movie that wants to be in that noir thriller, ambiguous ending. These systemic injustices are just inherent and necessarily within the world of noir thrillers. I don't think that that's the case in real life, but within noir thrillers can't necessarily be defeated. But ultimately the movie wanting to be this inspiring message of hope, but also because it wants to be in that noir tradition, it can't necessarily fully get there because it has to both wrestle with the problems of the world and wants to have that ambiguity and wants to sit with it, but also wishes to reaffirm the heroic nature of our protagonist. And so it ends up being in kind of diametrically opposing positions to itself in a way that I am not hating. And I want to make this clear because I feel like some people will come away from this video being like, Jesse hated this movie and despised it and thought it was awful. I'm like, no. I love this movie because I think it might have failed in what it was ultimately trying to do, but in ways that I find to be deeply, deeply fascinating. And it's what I love about art and movies is that they make me think. And so when a blockbuster movie, especially a blockbuster movie, can have this tension within itself and maybe failing at its objective, but in a way that I find fascinating to talk about, I love it and I revel in it. And this movie, I think, did it for me, even where it fails in a lot of aspects and in ways that I find somewhat problematic too. But there are ways that I find to be very interesting, and I really am excited to hear all of your thoughts about it. I love talking about imperfect art because I think seeing this tension being worked out in this character, Batman, and within the filmmakers, showcases an interesting shift from Zack Snyder's work, from Christopher Nolan's work, in a film that's trying to wrestle with these issues, but ultimately trying to not be too ambiguous, trying to it's gonna be okay. And I think that represents a shift in our society where people are starting to recognize the systemic injustices within our world, within the United States in particular, but ultimately being still scared to understand what it would mean that we do have to address those systems. It showcases how within systemic systems like the Hollywood system and Warner Brothers that these issues are starting to be felt and yet ultimately still not fully being challenged by these big corporate systems too, but also needing to be addressed and desiring to be addressed by filmmakers like Matt Reeves. I think it's an interesting peek into that window of starting to feel unsettled, but not being willing to sit in it. And I think we need to sit in it. I think that's what my channel has always been about when we discuss these issues, right? Sitting in the gray, wrestling with the uncomfortability, wrestling with the anxiety of being in that place. That ultimately this movie doesn't feel comfortable getting to, staying there, but gets close to it. I mean, at the end of the film, Gotham's still flooded. And Bruce Wayne says things are going to get worse before they get better. So I think it's starting to get there. But it needs to go a little bit further to confront people individually, to confront people themselves, not just the system, but what it means for us to be in these systems and what it means for us to perpetuate these systems and who holds power and who they benefit within these systems. And I think it's just really fascinating to discuss how that anxiety is both displayed and pulled away from within the Batman. So that's my thoughts on the ideology and politics of the Batman movie. I would love to hear your thoughts though. Like I said, this is me sort of talking off the cuff, having just seen the movie. So I'm sure I can and maybe will do a whole video essay about this movie, especially once it comes out on DVD. And even more so, I'm curious to see how this movie is going to spin off into the ultimate Gotham police show, which I had very little interest in watching before this, but after shows like The Peacemaker, as well as what this film was ultimately trying to confront, but ultimately not really addressing with the police force of Gotham within the film, I'm now way more curious because I'm like, what are the politics of that Gotham PD movie or TV show going to be? I don't know if it'll be good. It probably will be very bad, but I'm very curious as well. And so I'm just fascinated. So I want to hear all that below. Let me know. I might do a video essay on this in the future, but I had to get this out. I had to talk about it. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Beyond that, I'm going to go to bed. It's late for me. This was a 3-hour movie and it's late now. So I love you all and I wish you all a good live long and prosper.